Social mobility is a topic where actually we haven't seen as much progress over the last years than you might think about. It's actually rather disappointing, and I'm not talking about the UK, I talk about most of the Western world, in fact. When you look at performance, schooling outcomes by social background, you can see that in Mexico, that 10% of the kids from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, marked here in red, are doing less well than the 10% of kids from the privileged background. So people say, well, poverty is driving learning outcomes. It's not schooling. But in fact, you compare that with the next country on the list, in Chile, and you can see how similar kids from similar backgrounds come out very differently. If you are from a disadvantaged background in Chile, you do less well than if you come from a disadvantaged background, from the same background in Mexico. And you can now do that across countries. And you can actually suddenly see how different the success of children from similar backgrounds actually is across the world. And it actually tells us how poorly, and I'm not saying this is all about schooling, all about education, but how badly our societies do in leveraging the talent of disadvantaged children. This is what social mobility is really about. You can draw a line across this. Now you can see actually that 10% of the most disadvantaged children in Shanghai outperform the 20% from the most wealthiest background in the UK, and the 10% of the wealthiest kids in the US. This doesn't tell us how great Shanghai is doing, but it does tell us something about how poorly we are doing in many parts of the world in leveraging the talent of disadvantaged children. Could be doing a lot better than what you can see on this chart. Now, the more depressing part of that is that a big part of this is not by accident, but by design. In fact, we have looked at how teacher allocation works, and you can see actually that's the red bar. In most countries, we give the disadvantaged kids also the less qualified teachers and the poorer resources. So our education system in many parts of the world actually reinforce social disadvantage. Very few countries have succeeded with attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classes. And if you find those countries, they tend to be more than Asia. The UK, by the way, contrary to public opinion, is not doing so bad on this. You can get a lot worse on this now, on the right side of the chart. But in general, this tells us about failure by design. The incentive structures and support structures that our schools provide for social mobility are not really very much functioning. Is it worth to change it? Actually, this is an interesting picture. When I look at actually the equity and resource allocation. This is not how much you spend on education. Actually, spending alone has remarkably little impact on either quality and outcomes. Now, at least in the kind of OECD world, among the wealthiest countries, once you spend more than $50,000 per student per year, reach actually very little. Equity and resource allocation. There is sort of some scattering around this, but you can generally see the more equitably you spend your money, the better the results overall. But interestingly, only very few countries, Finland at the top, are actually aligning resources with the challenges. The UK has sort of tried this. Now, the pupil premium is a good example where actually more resources are now going into greater disadvantage. But that is still outweighed by lots of other spending patterns that work in the other way around. When you sum it all up, very, very few countries are getting that right, aligning the resources with the challenges. But what you can see from the chart is very worth doing that. The reality is basically, if you spend your money on wealthy kids, you get a lot less of a return than investing it well on disadvantage. Some people still say, well, this is all about context, background. You haven't accounted for the immigrants. So I want to do that now. And people say, well, we haven't got the right immigrants to do well and so on. So here, basically, I look at all of that. I look at students from the first generation of Turkey, coming out of Turkey, accounting for their social background in different countries. And you can see actually, in the Netherlands and Denmark, they do a bit better. But in most countries, those first generation immigrants come out pretty much the same. And that's not a surprise because they just came into the country. They haven't been born there. You wouldn't expect that the results after accounting for all background factors come out so differently. But once they are in the second generation, the picture looks very different. Now, these are the children of those Turkish immigrants who were born in the country of destination. And suddenly you see, for example, Germany and Switzerland, same in the first generation. In the second generation, the Swiss are a school year ahead. The country of origin does make a difference. I can show you this. It's no surprise. You get students from Pakistan, it's going to be very different than you get students from China. But the country of destination has a far greater impact, and that's what we underestimate. You can see that nicely on this chart. More timely, these days we talk about students from the Arab-speaking countries. You can do the same. See? They do better in the Netherlands, UAE a bit, then Denmark, Finland. Finland, they do actually not really that well. Finland doesn't do everything well. Qatar, should be their home country, but actually they come up poorest. No. But I want to measure something else here, and that's a sense of belonging, social well-being. Now, this is not academic performance. And you can actually see that, Finland doesn't do particularly well on academic integration, but it's number one in terms of giving students that kind of sense of belonging in the school. Social integration, something actually, and again you can see how school systems and societies make a difference. Denmark, doing so-so on academic integration, doing really poorly on social integration. Nordic countries are not Nordic countries, but the country of destination can make a huge difference. This, I could show you lots of more data now. You can basically see, the country that is doing poorest on this is France. Belgium comes very close afterwards. These countries may do a good job on academic integration reasonably, but when it comes to social integration, they come out so-so. I could show you a lot of more data actually highlighting how much of a difference social systems, including education, can actually make to strengthen social mobility. But it's not happening. Overall, the result, this is one of the most disappointing data that we have. Why is it, aggregation is a big factor. Now, you can basically see here, we try to lump students with disadvantage together, particularly students with an immigrant background, and that has a magnifying effect. Basically, those students face a double and triple and quadruple effect of social disadvantage. That's getting very, very hard to moderate then. Again, that is a feature by design of our school systems that we really need to be looking at. Pre-primary education, everybody knows that's a very powerful tool to sort of build strong foundations, to level the playing field and so on. And you can really see that. When you look at the PISA scores of those children who had and had not attended pre-primary education, you can see that there's a big difference. By the way, it's one of the big success stories of the UK. 15 years ago, when we presented our first OECD reports, the UK had a non-existing early learning system. Now it's well established, pretty universal. Still too much biased, in my view, towards care and less on quality learning. But that's a different story. You can see the impact on this. So you can say, actually, students with an immigrant background should really go to early learning. They could actually get a lot out of this when they become 15. That's what we know. But then the reality is this, and the UK is no exception. Actually, those children who need that most get the least out of it. Very, very few countries on the right side where you can actually say, they're trying. Canada is in Norway, Turkey. They're trying actually to make those services accessible to those who can actually benefit most. In the majority of countries, they're on the left side. Again, failure by design. So I've talked a lot about it. I was actually asked to look at, professionalization, what we can actually do through teaching and learning. So let me highlight this with a couple of points. Every time, I meet people in Britain, they tell me British teachers are really, really good on constructivist learning. And I surveyed British teachers, and I found the same. 96% of teachers say, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. Or, students learn best by finding solutions on their own. Or, thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. That's what British teachers say us, quite consistently. Now we are in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But then, we started to look into classrooms, what's actually happening in classrooms. One of the things that we did is actually, we looked at to what extent memorization dominates learning. Now, if British teaching would be really following the kind of constructivist method, you would find Britain at the bottom of the list. But you can't, because that place is already occupied by Switzerland. And then comes Poland. And then comes Germany. Where do you find Britain? Actually, yeah. And this is interesting. Teachers have a consistent view that what they do is a very modern, constructivist, open learning. Actually, students tell us the learning experiences are actually rather shallow in terms of learning lots of things, but at a limited level of cognitive depth, cognitive demand. If I had asked you before, who comes out on top, the answer that I often hear is China. But actually, China just comes out so in the middle. And actually, most East Asian countries come out somewhere in the middle of this. The East Asian countries do emphasize memorization, not as much as the UK, but actually somewhat. But they do something else. And actually, China is a really interesting example, Shanghai. They do emphasize memorization. Students learn a lot of stuff, and they don't waste time with basic, simple things. They know those things. But they also emphasize reasoning, deep learning, intrinsic motivation, critical thinking. And that's actually something, anyone who has been in classrooms around the world will have observed this. In those countries, it's not about accumulating a lot of subject matter content. It's very much about thinking like a mathematician, thinking like a scientist, thinking like a historian. And you can see that in the data that we collected from students about their learning strategies. Why do I tell you this? Because, we have often a lot of beliefs about ourselves that may have actually, what we believe we are doing may actually differ a lot from what's actually happening in the classroom. And it's only if you can change what's actually happening in the classroom. I could show you even more disappointing data. The more discretion teachers have, in giving marks without objective tests, the more they tend to be biased towards penalizing disadvantage. Gender as well. We have actually very powerful data that tell us actually that we're not as good as we often think in making judgments that actually foster social mobility. A lot of this actually works against social mobility. Really interesting, that contrast between perceived and actually implemented practices. This is another example, same story. You can teach mathematics in one way, in which we are calling word problems. In Iceland, they do that a lot. They have relatively simple mathematics embedded in complicated text, and then they teach students lots of those kinds of things. Interestingly, if you go to China, they rarely do this. In the UK, sort of in the middle. Now, that kind of teaching, these kind of mile-wide, inch-deep curricula are not very prevalent in East Asia. So another way you can teach math, and that's basically focusing on conceptual understanding. And suddenly you find the positions of Iceland and Shanghai totally inverted. Why do I show you this? Because this is our policy. This is how we ask teachers to teach. This is about curriculum design, about teacher training, teacher development. Huge differences across countries. And as I said before, the level of conceptual understanding, cognitive demand in British classrooms is a lot less than you might sort of think intuitively. Enough of that. The question, of course, is, does it make a difference? And here comes another surprise for many. Some people say, well, student-oriented learning is the magic key that's going to solve all problems. Actually, students at the lower end of the performance spectrum benefit from student-oriented learning. At the high end, you see that actually a lot less prevalent when you look at this around the world. Some people say, teacher-directed instruction is not a good thing, frontal learning or how people call it. Actually, it's not what the evidence suggests. It's actually quite an effective strategy across the whole spectrum. But what really matters at the top end of the distribution is really what I call cognitive activation. Having high expectations for students, making sure that students sort of understand the depths of the subject, becoming really good experts. Again, goes against conventional wisdom, but is really important. What can we do about this? Challenges for teachers are tough. I don't need to go through this. Previous speakers have already done this.